Is it going? Yeah. Cool, we're on the record now. Okay, so yes, thanks for having us here to give this little presentation. I think this will be fun. It'll be nice and informal. We kind of have a lot of experiences that we want to talk about as far as what we've the experiences that we've had writing research papers. So I'm at Francis. I'm a postdoc with Penny Rangmani. I don't think I met the three of you before, but yeah, so I finished my PhD almost 3 years ago now, so that's crazy. Who are you?
I'm Nate. I'm a former interfaces trainee, still an interfaces trainee. I'm also a PhD student. I'm a PhD student with Femini Rangwani and Boris Kramer.
Yeah.
So I have less experience writing papers than Emmett, but different interesting experiences. So
Yeah, and I was a PhD student in biomedical engineering at Davis, actually. So which programs are you guys in?
should we just do introductions?
Yeah, we should just,
so
we might as well, right? If that's okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just right in the middle of chewing too. Well,
I'm Catherine. I am in the biomedical sciences program here.
okay, nice.
Next.
I'm Dylan, I'm in mechanical engineering.
Yeah,
I'm John and I'm in bioengineering.
okay. Oh, Jim.
I'm Gian, I'm a mechanical engineer in Paramecia.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, so, oh, do you want to, I need to click it, right? Yes. Okay, yeah, so this was a little primer. I don't even know if it's all readable right now, but this is an XKCD comic. Which if you're not familiar with XKCD, should definitely look through some of the relevant things they have. I think one of the favorite ones here is the paper titled "My Colleague is Wrong and I Can Finally Prove It." That's a common paper sentiment, at least. It's not usually the title. So yeah, I think the idea of what we go through today is basically, based on our experience, what we see is a recommended kind of timeline / workflow for starting with the ideas that go into a scientific paper to actually crafting the paper and charting it out, and then finally submitting it, right? And all of the things in between. And so it's going to be kind of sweeping generalities, right? And it's all very subjective in the end, because you ask different people about the correct way to write a scientific paper, they'll give you very different ideas. So that's kind of something to emphasize, but we'll give our 2 cents on it, and then give a couple examples of papers that we've worked on and kind of lessons that we took away from that as far as pulling those together. One useful reference that I was going to point to was this paper that was in Nature Biotech, which was an open letter to grad students and other procrastinators. It's time to write. It had a lot of nice little takeaway lessons that this professor had put out there. And so I'll reference that at some point, but it's worth taking a look just to get one person's ideas on this. And so, yeah, basically, the place to start is with the actual ideas that would eventually form a paper, right? So for any of us here, right, as a graduate student or as a postdoc, we're doing research, everything that we're working on should ideally be going towards some manuscript, right? Because that's in the end the scientific currency that we're kind of trading in, right? So how do you actually get towards that, right? Well, an important thing and something that RPI does well actually too is thinking about how is this content that you're working on actually going into papers, and how are you dividing it into different manuscripts, right? Planning ahead about that, right? So a place that I would generally start and is actually fairly helpful is trying to formulate what's the central question that you're trying to answer / what's your hypothesis, right? Not all research is hypothesis driven, but probably most of the research that those of us who are here would be doing is more hypothesis driven. And so the things that I like to emphasize that I've learned about crafting a good hypothesis before was you want it to be specific, not too specific, but specific enough to be testable and really to be falsifiable, right? Because you don't want to end up with some hypothesis that is almost guaranteed to be true because it's so generic, right? So my example was, because I thought about immune cells in the past and calcium in immune cells. A bad hypothesis would probably be like, we hypothesize calcium plays an important role in immune cells. One thing, we already know that. Another thing, it's like, what is an important role that's not specific whatsoever, right? So a good hypothesis that is actually close to the hypothesis of my thesis, and yeah, good in quotes maybe. We hypothesize that local calcium transients, so not just calcium overall, right, but specifying something about it, and that these enhance the strength of integrin-mediated adhesions in immune cells. Not that you have to understand the content there, but it's about being specific. It's something that could easily be disproven by experiments, right? And so these are some things that go into like crafting what might form a paper. It could form multiple papers depending on how it kind of shapes out, right? And once you formulated this, you're gonna come to some sort of central finding from the project, right? And that that will probably come after formulating the question and then the idea, because you might not have enough preliminary data or simulations to say exactly what the paper is going to be about. But that's definitely a discussion point. And then what journals are you targeting? It's actually like pretty helpful to try to target journals earlier on, I think. That's something that Professor Ramani does very well, is try to specify, okay, what journal are you thinking of for this paper? Because then you could really start to craft the paper with that audience in mind, right? And then authorship is also very important, just like laying that out at the top and saying, okay, this is gonna be your first author paper. We expect, you're working with these undergrads, they'd probably also be on the paper. You're co-advised, so we'll both be, corresponding author. These sort of conversations should happen early and often too. So, and then timeline as well. Should always have like some target submission date, probably. It could be, a year out if it's a project that's early on, or even further, right, for some PhD projects. So where to actually start writing, I guess, once you have some ideas down, you have some results, even maybe. One possible strategy, which might not be super viewable here, is starting with the title. And this came from this perspective that I pointed to. He wrote here, why begin with the title? I'm asking you to think deeply about your project and pull out the golden essence of it, extract it as a single short-ish sentence. Not all titles are short, but ideally, shorter is better. Think of the singular major claim at the heart of the work, at the highest level of meaning. What's your intended audience's level of expertise? Again, emphasizing audience. What is it that they should know, having been exposed to a procession of newly birthed experimental evidence that they and all others did not or could not have known before? So really emphasizing the novelty of this, right? And then just emphasizing proof is not required at this point, right? This would be like earlier on in the conception of the paper. Only what you think boiled down to one or two short phrases based on what you know. Titles are very hard, so it is helpful to come up with one early on. It's going to be iterated upon, right? Probably. But I liked this suggestion. I don't necessarily always go with it, but it's worth a shot. And then an outline, some sort of an outline is going to be essential as you start working on the paper, right? And different labs and different people will do this very differently, but there should be some form of outline. I think even just having, charted out what's going to go in figure 1, what's going to go in figure 2, what's going to go in figure 3, so on and so forth, shooting for 5 or 6 figures or something. Even breaking it down panel by panel can be very helpful. And that's a suggestion that I've heard before too. I put up this was like a little outline that I had written at some point, which we don't need to look at the details here, and it's not a perfect example or anything, but this was just saying like, okay, I have an idea of what's going into each figure of the paper, basically. These are very, very generic items and it's not necessarily clear what goes into each figure just from what I might have written out here. So I recommend even further detail, like panel by panel granularity is very helpful. And then you also start to think of things that you might have missed as far as your design of experiments or your design of simulations, depending on what you're working on. You don't want to realize these things once you're actually writing the paper, right? You want to think about that ahead of time and make sure that all of the experiments have been designed properly. The figures, every panel is kind of necessary to the story and moving things forward, right? So that's kind of my approach to outlining, and everybody would have different approaches to this again, right?
I usually do it in slides, like I make the figures as I go.
Yeah. But for a figure that you haven't made yet.
I'll put in placeholders, like this is what I want in
A,
this spot.
this is B, this, yeah. Yeah, I think that's pretty helpful, actually. But, yeah, I think, yeah, basically just a slide deck is a pretty common one. You might not have think of that immediately for an outline, but it basically is now, right? I like that. Cool.
Right.
Okay, so. Yeah, so I'm still gonna go here, so. Another important thing is having a timeline for the paper, right? And one approach that I take to building timelines when I am on top of things is actually making some sort of Gantt chart. I don't know if you are all familiar with that, but this is what they generally look like. And you can essentially put different tasks in parallel with each other or in series, depending on what order you might need to do things. In this case, I broke up things into a few figures that I was working on. And I said, okay, I need to finish some analysis, and then I could go on to running some more simulations and then making some final figures. So that's why these kind of appear in parallel and in series. And then like I'm running simulations in parallel, so that's why those show up. So I found this to be a useful tool. There's a lot of tools for making Gantt charts. I just used this online Gantt chart tool. And again, like different labs, different PIs would have different preferences as far as this goes. But this is a helpful way for me to see things. Because one thing that you'd start to see is like, oh wait, I have so many things in parallel. One person can't do all of that at one time, right? So that's actually very helpful. Yeah, and to make sure that you're really focused, right? You don't want to just be running more experiments, running more simulations, just to kind of figure out what's next, right? You want to be able to be answering a specific question that goes towards the paper. And then I just flop a little bit.
So this is now continuing on how you approach a blank page, just some general tips that we had. So in general, sure, don't rely on jargon. I think this goes without saying, but someone who's new in the field should be able to pick up the paper and understand what you're talking about. Try to avoid passive voice where possible. This can be very hard in science, and people have different philosophies about how they like to write, especially how they like to write in methods. I will always err on the side of using, we did this, we did that, rather than saying like the experiment was done in this way. And we have some examples of like this hypothesis was tested by versus we tested this hypothesis. And so on and so forth. And then always try to be precise and specific with your words. I think kind of the number one comment I get from Boris, one of my PIs, is this isn't precise or this isn't specific. Can you clarify? And then always think about the audience, like every word or every kind of description or word choice depends on the audience. So if you're writing to a very field specific journal, you can rely more on jargon than if you're writing to a general audience journal. And then I've never had a problem with this since I work in LaTeX, and references always kind of happen at the same time when you work in LaTeX, but add references as you go. I think there's a tendency to like add a comment in Word, oh, this is the reference I want, and then add it later.
People still do that in LaTeX.
Okay, but add them as you go, otherwise it's a
Don't ask me how I know. But I mean, I feel like that might be the number one comment from PIs across grad students is references.
And then all the reference managers, which are free or paid, have ways to connect with the various ways to write. So it's super, there's not an excuse.
And when you write your introduction, basically your introduction should be so concise that if you can write a whole sentence without having a reference in it, probably didn't need the sentence. Either that or you're missing a reference.
That's a super good point. That's a good rule of thumb, actually. Wait, what happened?
I don't know why I exited.
We'll get back.
Okay.
And do you generally agree about the active voice kind of point?
Yes.
I'm curious as another.
Yeah, I mean, there are occasional contexts like the abstract of an NIH grant where they specifically say not to use first person.
Yeah.
But unless the instructions say don't use the first person, don't be constrained. The other thing you want to think about a wee bit is the use of tense. So it's it's okay to mix tenses. You know, people tend to think that you have to use one consistent tense the whole time, but actually tense is used all the time in language as a way of conveying distinction. And one of the distinctions is between sort of what is done versus what you found. And so often, for example, parts of the methods may be written in the present tense because they're sort of describing, for example, some protocol or procedure. You could say something like, I don't know, NIH guidelines are followed is perfectly fine because it's true not only at the time you wrote the, at the time you did the study and the time you wrote the paper, but in general. Other times when you did something specific, you use the past tense, and it's fine to mix and match, to mix tenses. People are used to that, but you want to be aware of it because if you mix them in the wrong way, it sends all kinds of confusing signals. I think often for results, since results you're describing something you've already discovered and found, then often the results I often go through and change results to past tense. Another thing about writing results, and I might be repeating what you're saying or jumping ahead, but you should not describe the figure or the table. You describe the result. Okay. So you don't say figure 4 shows a plot of X of Y versus X. Yeah. You say we saw that, over time, the protein kinase A phosphorylation increased significantly. And actually a good sort of way to force yourself to do that is just put the figure reference in parentheses. Right? You don't have to do it like that. You could say as shown in figure 4 or something, but avoid describing the figure or the table. Describe the result and then reference the figure in the table. If you need to say something about the figure or the table, like how it's, if it needs some explanation, and these days people do quite complex data representations that, they don't necessarily, can't necessarily be interpreted without some explanation. Put that in the caption of the figure or the table. And then, another rule is if your figure or table or caption contains any abbreviations, you have to define them right then and there, because the way a lot of people read papers is they read the abstract and they go straight to the results and they look at the figures. And then they read the figures, and if it's full of jargon and acronyms that they have to search through the paper, they don't actually get it. So assume that someone's pretty much jumped straight to your figures. And so also on that, and I don't pick up, that's doing a great job.
This is
I tell my students when they're outlining papers, some people say storyboard your paper, and what it really means is it's the results that you're really storyboarding. And sort of before you even have the graph, think about what the graph would look like and what its purpose it's serving, or the table. Sometimes it turns out that all you're trying to show in a graph or a table is 2 numbers. And if that's all you're trying to do, just put it into text, but you can still storyboard. First I'm going to start with the demographic data or the validation methods, and then I'm going to show the characterization, then I'm going to show the, and think of it as the story that you're telling with the figures in the tables and the data that are in your results, because there's a tendency to present results in the order in which they were obtained, which is reasonable and often logical, but it's not always the most informative way to convey the story and lead up to the conclusion. So spend some time storyboarding your manuscript, particularly the results section.
And things will get juggled around for sure, as we, when we put papers together, for sure, it's you bring it to your advisor, and then probably things get swapped around a little bit, or like, what if this part came first, right?
Or left out completely.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah. So no, it's
and in general, I would, unless your advisor's like not at all like me, I think they would rather see an outline of your manuscript before you try to write it, particularly if it's your first one. And, the number of times that the students come to me with, their first draft of the paper, and the first draft was actually just the introduction. And the introduction was 5 pages long, and I deleted 4 pages of it. And then I apologize and say, it's not that these 4 pages aren't great, and
Yeah.
you can save it for your thesis, but this is a paper, and look at an average paper, it's like, its introduction is usually on the first page, and it's usually 3 paragraphs.
Yeah.
You don't have time to spend, 2 or 3 journal pages telling the big story as to why you're doing this study. So.
I see that just like in papers that I've reviewed as well. It's like, it's just, you can tell, it's like, wait, there's like 10 paragraphs in the introduction, what's going on?
Yeah.
So that's why I was like, the introduction is not a literature review. That could be the temptation. You're like, oh, I read all these papers and I can give all the context.
Yeah.
Which is great, but it has to be distilled somehow. It's hard.
Yeah, I like to think of the introduction as a funnel.
Yeah.
So you start with the big picture
Yeah.
and then you narrow
And you
down.
have to come down quickly.
Yeah, very specific gap that you're actually addressing.
And another mistake people make with the introduction is not actually setting expectations. But even sometimes the title makes this mistake. Is the last, one of the biggest mistakes you can make that will ensure that you get reviews that you weren't expecting is to craft the introduction in a way that it sets expectations for something you didn't actually do or for a result you didn't actually get. So you definitely want to ask a question, say what we know, what we don't know, and why that led you to what you did. And I'm also fine with an introduction that even gives part of the story away because people have already read the abstract. So it's fine if the last sentence of the introduction says something about what you found. Partly because that will help you stay focused on what you actually found, because the number of papers that I read where the introduction makes it sound like they're, trying to find the cure for cancer, and it turns out they did not find the cure for cancer. So it's easy as a reviewer to say, well, they said they were going to find the cure for cancer and they didn't, so therefore I'm rejecting it. Which, it's a little bit harsh, but it's something you bring on yourself when you write your introduction.
That's a good point for the title too, because there's a lot of titles that overstate the claims of the paper just by themselves. Abstracts too, right? They definitely, they'll say something in the abstract and then it's like, oh, you did not show this in the paper. So
Right.
Those are things to be very careful of, I think.
And then I always like to read other papers from groups that I really like. Like there's certain groups that I'm like, those people write really well. And I'll always refer to those for kind of stylistic advice. So we can keep going through the paper. We talked about methods or results a lot. This diagram has the methods as kind of the funnel of the middle of this whole hourglass. I guess that makes sense. It's like the most specific thing to your work. My methods tend to be very different because there's a lot of math in them, but it should be the stuff necessary to reproduce that work.
By the way, in the past, we've had some of our interfaces students and in sessions like this talk about ways for generating methods that are more reproducible, particularly by using various kind of standard resource identifiers and things for protocols and for reagents. And so when there's some sort of a standard, if you can adhere to it and then say it, it actually makes it easier to write your methods and it makes your paper more reproducible. There are lots of things out there that people, for the most part, don't use, but the more you use, the better off we'll be. It's the same with computational. Like there's a whole NIH center up in Seattle that's dedicated to reproducible modeling, and they've developed all kinds of tools and databases and resources. Almost nobody uses them. Right?
This is sorry, Herbert's.
Yes, yeah. I'm on their advisory board, so.
Nice, yeah.
Yeah, and you can avoid that kind of the rabbit hole of, oh, we use this protocol from this paper, and then that paper cites another paper, and
Right.
the poor grad student is crying.
Yeah.
We talked a lot about results, so I don't need to hit home again, and then discussions kind of brings it back out. So you talk about the context of your results. And I try to be as transparent as possible without kind of debunking my whole study, but about the or the limitations of my findings and then the implications, so like the so what of what it means for the broader community. And then in some papers, there's kind of a figure associated with the discussion to bring home the story. But that depends on the journal and what you're trying to say. So this is a fun little exercise we had decided to do from passages from one of the Emmett's papers. So this is are these passages discussion or results? And I think you can read them from the back. So if you can, I want to try to do it as like an audience participation.
I could say something about what's happening in the figure.
Yeah,
too.
do you want to explain the figure a little bit?
Yeah, this was actually from my undergrad research. I was doing these experiments with neutrophils with white blood cells that were held in micropipettes, which is the little object shown there. And then there was also a fungal model particle that was brought towards the cell in another pipette. So the cell would reach out and try to grab it under the right circumstances due to chemical signals that were getting released from the particle on the left. And then basically we measured calcium during this whole process of the cell reaching out, and we saw it didn't increase through this. And then eventually if we hand it over the particle, the white blood cell will engulf it. And during that, you do see a big calcium increase, which was, that part was kind of known, but that's so there's a whole story there, but that's not the point. That's what's going on in the figure. And then these were just a few statements that were in the paper that were primarily really written by my PI at that point. But this was, yeah, I guess people can read them. I don't have to read
Yeah.
them, so.
Does someone want to take a guess at where the first one went? Discussion and results. I can read it out aloud if that would help.
Discussion.
That one's actually the least clear,
Yeah.
the first one. Yeah, I agree, it could go either way.
Yeah.
That one actually is in the results, but it's like, it could go in the first part of the discussion, almost, it feels like summarizing what was found in the study. So, yeah. It's a bad or good example, depending on how you look at it. The others are more straight, or a little bit less ambiguous, I think, yeah.
So the next one. What do we think?
Discussion.
Yeah, and then. Kind of the same thing,
Discussion.
there's some context, and then finally the last one describes a. Actual result.
Yeah. And I think, at one point that I wanted to make here just is like. I think there are often discussion points that end up in results, and sometimes that's okay, depending on the journal, I guess.
I mean, some journals even have results and discussions.
Exactly.
And I think it's helpful to put your results in context, but
Mhm.
where you want to draw the line is when you're speculating or generalizing.
Yeah,
So, it's fine to not only describe the result, not the figure, but the result, but put it in context of, what it means in the context of your experiment. That's fine for your results. It's when you start to speculate about what it could mean, or compare it with someone else's experiment, or say how great it is, you probably should save that for the discussion.
right, yeah, like especially, it's like, oh, we're talking about sepsis here. If that were results, then the reviewer would be like, you didn't look at anything relevant to sepsis whatsoever, so what are you doing? Yeah, it's just something to keep in mind.
Cool. So once you have that, the rest is revise, revise, revise. So writing the first draft, which in my experience, I've never sat down and written an entire first draft. And then passed it over to my advisors, even though that's what Boris, one of them, wants. It doesn't work that way. So this kind of comic is showing how it keeps going, like final version 2, version 6 with comments, version 8 with comments and corrections, and then revision 22 with a lot of comments. So it goes on and on and on. And
It's not the best file naming system here.
no,
But
and that is an important point to bring up, like have a good way to track this. It depends on what you like and what your advisor likes. I always put the date on the first of at the beginning of everything, and then if you do it in the right way, you can automatically sort by date if you sort by name in your folder, so that's very helpful. You have to be able to take feedback. That's sometimes always, or sometimes very direct to the point. It can be constructive, but it might say this paragraph sucks. Let's fix it. And then sometimes the writing can feel overwhelming, so this is an example from part of the methods of my first paper. And the whole paper looked like this, like every page had this much or more comments, and it just kept going iteratively. Like this, and it can be overwhelming, but it made the paper way better in the end.
Yeah, does Padmini do things on PDF and then Boris on Over? Like, do you have to jump between the two?
Boris only downloads the PDF and then read comments like that.
Okay,
And Padmini either downloads and marks it up on her iPad or directly edits an overlay.
okay, gotcha.
So I'm just constantly flipping back and forth.
Yeah, that's good for me to know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's clear, I guess it's clear to, or it's good to be clear about that with the advisors.
Boris will never write directly in overlay.
Interesting.
I mean, for me, I really like to see an outline before you start to write a lot, because often, to me, the biggest issues have to do with the logic of the manuscript and the story you're telling, and often that's a matter of moving around arguments, even in the introduction. And so if it's in bullet point form, I can move things around easily and explain why. Once, by the time it's in paragraph form, if I start cutting big chunks and pasting them somewhere else, it's not necessarily obvious why, and so it makes it harder to give useful feedback.
Or it just needs to be rewritten at that point too. Which,
Yeah, it looks like I'm asking it to be rewritten.
Yeah.
But it being done at an outline level, it would have been easier for me, but easier for Trini to understand what I was trying to say.
Yeah, that makes sense.
One style is every paragraph is bullets, like the whole intro all the way to the discussion is bulleted out.
Yeah.
Before you write it, and then you can iterate on that.
Yeah.
Which that's Boris's ideal way of writing.
And this is particularly even more important when it comes to writing a grant.
Yeah.
Because when you write a grant, it's all about the logic. By the time you have the result of the paper, the logic, hopefully you understand.
Yeah.
Hopefully you understand why you did it, the study, and what the significance of the results are, and you can craft your paper to reflect that. But even that, people can, go astray on. But when you're writing a grant, it's all about the logic. Right? And so I spend a lot of time when I write grants, basically bullet pointing, particularly the background section, because the background is the rationale that leads to the aims. And I've already written the aims and the specific aims in one page. By the time I've written the background, which might be 2 pages with 50 references, each with a couple of paragraphs that leads up to the hypothesis that constitutes the aim, I've gone back and changed my aims, even if it's just a few words in one sentence. And then once you've got that reasoning of why you're doing, you want to actually recapitulate that in the actual research design section with a short subheading on rationale, just to remind the reviewer, okay, why are we doing this again? It's the same with writing manuscripts. It's just generally, the logic of your manuscripts is normally easier because you've seen it to conclusion. But when you haven't started, the reasoning that you think you have and the reasoning you could end up with could be quite different.
Yeah, that's true.
Cool. So just a few notes on submission. Always review the journal guidelines. I generally don't do this until the end. If you're writing to a journal that is very particular about page limits and reference limits and figure limits, that's important, but in general, they accept a format free submission the first time, so you can always revise later. The first time you submit, it's nice to have someone there to help you. I submitted my first paper alone, and I messaged my advisors like for 2 hours on Slack trying to figure out what I put in each thing. So it would have been much nicer if that was done in an office with other people.
Although it depends on the advisory team, a lot of advisors will submit on their own, right?
Right.
So, but people already know this probably. People have had all sorts of different experiences.
More often than not, the mentor is the corresponding author.
So I will log in as the advisor and look at that.
Yeah, but I mean, I think the thing I wanna emphasize there too is just like, it helps to see. Assuming that you're gonna continue maybe in submitting papers and stuff, it does help to see at some point, like what goes into all of the submission steps. Cause it can be somewhat confusing.
And it's very, very, very important that every person who's not only an author, but who's acknowledged on that manuscript has already seen it and approved you're submitting it before you approve it.
Yes.
Otherwise, you could definitely be in a situation.
Yeah, but that's a good point.
And I always preprint. I don't know if we need to strongly consider, but I guess I want to go out there on a paper that wasn't pre-printed, so maybe it's still a thing to put up there, but preprints are great. I like them. I don't do anything that's secret enough to not warrant doing on the preprints.
Yeah, cause there's exceptions to, of course, but yeah.
So another thing is supplemental data. So the journals differ. So some journals will publish supplemental data. Some will publish very specific forms of supplemental data like a PDF. Increasingly, journals are relying on some sort of other server to provide the supplemental data. So it could be something like Figshare, or it could be GitHub. And even if you're using GitHub, you can still create a DOI for that. This tool called Zenodo that we use that generates a DOI that when you click on the DOI, it takes you to Zenodo, but it essentially feeds everything from GitHub, and you can freeze the release. So it can either give you the latest release, or it can give you whatever the release was at the moment that you submitted the paper or that the paper was accepted. So it's quite helpful. The days where we would actually sort of create our own resources for supplements, we would put it on some lab. Those are long gone. You don't want to do that because they don't last. Maybe it'll be there in a year, but the chances it'll be there in 10 years are practically zero. So make sure that if your supplemental data isn't being published by the journal itself, or if they're only publishing, say, supplemental PDF methods, but not other more specific data sets. And some of them, say if it's a RNA-seq data set, it would go into GEO, for example. So there are databases you could use. Their protein structures can be very data bank. So you definitely want to use existing databases. But even just a bunch of extra figures, if you can't put those on the journal supplement, or you can only put a PDF, but you actually really would like to have all of your R code or a Jupyter notebook or something, put them somewhere else like GitHub, and then create a DOI and just list that in the data access portion.
Yeah, I worked on a paper where I was collecting a bunch of models. And there's the number of high impact models in this field that had a link to some PI's website, and then the model is never there.
Yeah.
I just had to leave out some of the biggest models of this system on paper.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And then carefully consider your suggestions for reviewers and the exclusions you'd like. I'm not an editor, but I suppose this is taken into consideration.
Oh, it is. And you should know that these days, it's getting harder and harder to get reviewers for papers. And one of the reasons is the number of papers that's getting submitted is going through the roof. And it's not really so much from the United States, it's from other countries. And actually, a lot of these papers are really bad. But the journals that are publishing them are major journals, because a journal like PLOS One or Scientific Report, they publish more papers than, in the case of PLOS One, and all the other PLOS journals combined. So they publish, and they're open access, and so they have a incentive to publish as many papers as possible because they make money out of it. And then there are a lot of institutions and a lot of authors where if they don't publish, it affects their salary and it affects their promotion and their tenure much more directly than it does in our system where it's somewhat more holistic review of, you know, your performance. There's a lot of institutions where, you know, in junior faculty, they have to publish N papers with an impact factor greater than 4 in the first year, for example. And so there's this massive growth, and a lot of there's companies now that write papers for people, and some of them are completely fake. So there's a whole industry, and the result is that a lot of reviewers are more reluctant to review. There are more papers to review, and it's harder and harder to get referees. So, you know, it's not unusual for me sometimes to ask 18 people to do reviews. And at some point, I'm just like, and you know, the journal staff are like, you know, you still don't have a second review of this paper. I'm like, I've asked 12 people, I've asked 18 people. And at that point, I tend to get a little bit irked, and I say, tell you what, can you go back to the authors and say, give me 10 independent referees? So usually I've asked all the referees that the authors gave, but it might be 3, and they've all said no. So yes, give them, not only provide the suggested names of independent reviewers. If you name people who aren't independent, people you have a grant with, or people you've been on a paper with, or someone who's at your institution, they're going to say no anyway, because they'll use the fact that it's a conflict of interest as an excuse not to have to review another paper. So we don't get too many people who say yes when there is a conflict. We have plenty of people who were recommended by authors who say, no, I have a conflict. And you know, maybe sometimes that conflict is borderline, but they don't. So there's a lot of people who don't want to do it. And so it's very hard for journal editors to find reviewers, so give them lots of names.
18, that's right.
I'm sure it's on my record, it's probably 25 or something.
Wow.
And there are times when I've gone back to authors and say, I've tried 25 people and I couldn't get one single review of this paper. So my conclusion is that the readers of this journal will not be interested in your manuscript.
Yeah, you have to at that point. Yeah.
And then pay attention to your paper.
Oh, yeah.
We usually don't have one target journal, we'll have like a list of target journals and decreasing order of impact, or and we'll have a plan of how we want to submit.
Yeah.
And then don't stress the desk reject at the top places. It's not you. It's the journal. You can't publish everything. So a little bit of info on revisions and reviewer responses. We always sit down and discuss the response to reviewers and the reviewer suggestions. And we'll mock up how we're going to respond to each thing and make an action plan of the actions we need to do. So my most recent response document had the checklist, and I literally crossed things out as I was writing the response document.
And a good practice is to actually write the response before you, including writing the new thing that you're going to write or the change thing you're going to write in the response before you touch the manuscript. Because then that becomes the game plan for how you're going to revise the manuscript.
Yeah.
And it's fairly common that reviewers will make a remark that authors will misinterpret. So it's really worth, and it can go both ways. They can misinterpret in a way that causes them to do a lot of work that they didn't need to do, or they can give a response that is got nothing to do with what they're. So it's really worth making sure that you've discussed and thought about what is the reviewer really saying here. Because sometimes it's easy to sort of give a quick, almost knee-jerk response to what you think the reviewer is saying, and it's not actually what they're saying.
Right. And then be diplomatic. So if you disagree, don't just say, no, I disagree. And then I like to think about picking and choosing my battles. So there is a lot of things that I don't necessarily agree with, but I always try to appease as many of those as possible, unless it's going to severely change the paper or is not possible with what I can do.
Yeah, remember the editor looks at this too, and so the editor's gonna say, how well did they address the critiques? And actually, nobody wants to reread the manuscript. So you'll submit a red line, which will make it a little bit easier. But the easiest thing to do is to make it that by the time you've read, the reviewer has, and the editor have read the response to the reviews, they'll know what the reviewer said, and they'll know what you changed in response to what the reviewer said. And a good rule of thumb is you always want to change something. You know, that's the idea of picking your battles. If you say, no, we don't agree, and so we're not going to do it, it's, it just makes it too easy for an editor to say, well, you weren't responsive. And so, often it's hard to get referees, both referees or all referees to look at the revised manuscript, particularly if one of them wasn't that enthusiastic in the first place. The last thing they want to do is look at it again. So often it's up to the editor to make a decision, and they're basically you make it easy for the editors to reject it if it appears that you didn't make a change in response to what the review. If you simply answered the reviewer's question, but you didn't change the manuscript, you haven't actually done anything. So.
Yeah, there could be a temptation to just say, oh yeah, that's a good point, thanks for the point, and no, but you have to add text. You have to address something, it's yeah, it's important.
Yeah, don't assume the reviewer is asking a question out of curiosity.
Yeah.
And I will color code, or at least in the most recent paper I submitted, will color code the changes in the document for each reviewer. So we had 4 reviewers, so there was 4 different colors. The response for that reviewer was in the color, and then the changes were in that color.
It's extra impressive that you have 4 reviewers now.
Well, we're still waiting for 2 of them to get it.
Yeah, for the, yeah.
Yes.
Well, one of the reasons you can end up with 4 is because we know it's going to be hard. So if we can think of 8 people to ask, we ask 8.
Yeah.
And usually if you get 1 or 2 out of the 8, you'll be happy. But occasionally you'll get 4. So that's probably the main way you get down. 4.
Oh, yeah.
And then now we have a few case studies, but we're kind of short on time.
Yeah, actually, I think we should stop here for now, or right now, and just see if there's any questions or something to revisit.
Yeah. I'll look to the end and get on the fun points.
Oh, yeah, oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, that's nice.
This is just from experience.
Right through the entire research process. It is, yeah, it's not always easy, but the more effort you can, have an ongoing document and, building it up as you go along, that's definitely a great way to go. What was the who, what, when?
Like, these are kind of the essential things that you want to touch on, maybe not who in a research paper, but the what, the why, when why are we doing it now? How did we do it? What did we learn? And then what does it mean? Is the so what?
It's true for 8th grade essays, and it's true for scientific.
Well, we would do this exercise in 8th grade where we went through current news articles and have to answer the who, what, where, when, why, how, and so what. So I actually always think about this every time I sit down and write now.
Yeah.
But
yeah, and the quote from my previous, well, it's not even a quote, it was a rough idea, but he would always try to make sure that we, the ideal case would be somebody can look at a figure and really just be able to interpret it, without reading a caption, without reading anything, just kind of, it speaks for itself. Now, that's obviously not always possible in its entirety, but it's kind of a nice thing to shoot for, and to make it visually appealing, I feel like is kind of, under emphasized sometimes.
we have a lot of lab meetings about the colors.
But it's not a slide.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
I have one postdoc in my lab who makes these really elaborate figures, uses biorender and stuff. And so, the graphs have little pictures of mice on them and stuff. And they make great slides, but that's
Right.
what figures and papers look like.
Yeah, there's a distinction for sure. Yeah. Cool. Okay.
Any last comments?
Thank you. both for taking the time to do this, it's very valuable.
Well, thanks for adding all these thoughts too. It's actually a very helpful perspective too. So just comments on some of that. Yeah.
Cool.
But no questions. Is there anything else we wanted to hit?
I don't think so.
You don't want to mention anything about your paper?
Oh, well, I do a lot of interdisciplinary work, so I really work at the interface with two fields.
So maybe go to your slides real quick.
Yeah,
Alright, and I could give like a super quick summary, I
Okay.
guess, just from the last slide even. I was gonna tell a story, which I kind of made it very long-winded in my slides. But essentially, there was a paper from my PhD that we started working on. We got these cool measurements with immune cells. And eventually I decided to try to simulate the cell spreading process as well. And what we ended up doing is splitting it into two papers, which can definitely happen in certain cases. In that case, it was, one kind of theory oriented, one more experimentally oriented. So that's one reason to do so. Of course, you could have a project that, is all experiments and it gives rise to multiple papers where it was originally just going to be one. And so that's definitely something that happens, and just a few thoughts along those lines was like what you have to decide how to split things. So are there separate messages that you actually want to convey in like distinct papers, right? You'll see papers from the same lab that have like a lot of overlap or something like that, right? And you wouldn't want to do that. So like you wouldn't want two papers in mediocre journals or something over just a single high impact paper. So the case could be made for my paper, for instance, that combining theory and experiments is really powerful, and you could have a higher impact paper that way. We decided to go a different direction because there was so much to explore specifically about the theory in that case. Yeah, so and then if there's something like that, you obviously have to be fully transparent that there's a closely connected paper. And you have to be able to justify it to reviewers. So that's my not super short summary there.
and the one thing that's happened at Minis Lab quite a bit is there'll be like a terminal collaborator that we contribute a model to, and then we'll spin off a modeling paper that dives into the theory. So there'll be this kind of joint work where the models are similar, but then they get fleshed out a lot more in its own modeling or math paper. And then, so like I said, I do a lot of work at this kind of interface between modeling biological systems and then bringing in a lot of statistical and computational methods. So it's this balance between two audiences. There's the people who model biology most of the time, or the actual biologists, and then the computationalists and the statisticians. So this is kind of a few pieces of advice that I've had is really know your audience. Remember that there's two people from both fields. You have to make sure they all understand everything and really understand the importance of everything. So it's the onus is on you to make sure that folks from both fields appreciate your work, because you'll likely have kind of a reviewer from both places. So they'll ask an expert on the biology and then an expert on the computation, and both people have to appreciate the work and understand what's interesting and all about it. And then sometimes it can be very hard to make a novelty for both fields. Something like an application from one field might be novel, but you're just taking a method off the shelf from the other. So you really have to define the novelty as the application, not just the method. So it has to be clear to both groups what the gap is.
Yeah, I'm curious if you could talk a little more about this. Is the thing like I run into a lot, where it's like if I'm writing something that says I'm applying some method with some changes for a new problem that it hasn't been used on before, that people who do the methods work won't pay any attention to the problem. They will just say these are minimal modifications of the method. It's like, right, but that's not the paper.
Right.
And then, yeah, I think that can be hard to get around, like getting the people who do the method stuff to pay attention to the applications as an actual contribution.
Right, yeah, so these are reviews that I had
Yeah,
in this paper that I've been talking about. So the methods themselves are not novel.
right.
But the way we address this, as we said, one of the reviewers was very good at pointing out that the application is novel. So we really stressed it in the end of the intro, rather than saying that it's like a new way to do this, but it's a novel application of these tools to this field.
Yeah.
So highlighting that. And then I've presented these applications in a lot of technical conferences, and for the most part, folks are receptive to the learning about the interesting application
Yeah,
of how their tools can actually help.
And I think it also goes back to setting expectations just in the introduction, for instance, like if you make it sound like you've created an amazing new method, which can be a temptation probably, right? Then some reviewer who's more technically minded on
You're
this
setting
one's gonna
yourself
read it.
up for that criticism.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was entirely our fault. We made it seem like we had developed a new method when it was really a novel.
Yeah, and there were probably someone who wrote a paper on it, the method 20 years ago or something, that
Yeah.
you're getting on their bad side, so something to keep in mind.
I mean, it's interesting, sometimes you can write a paper that's essentially a methods paper that, you know, the new thing about the work is the method. And in fact, just the job of describing, characterizing, validating the method is a paper in and of itself. It's interesting, a lot of journals will outright reject manuscripts like that. Even journals that have a methodological focus, like PLOS Computational Biology specifically ask, what's the new biological insight?
Yeah,
Even though it's a journal about, you know, its title is about a method. But there are other journals that have realized that actually methods papers get more highly cited than most scientific papers. So Biophysical Journal, for example, they actually like methods papers because they know that methods papers get highly cited. And then, of course, the journals like Scientific Reports and PLOS One often, or a lot of the other journals that sort of the open source sister journals of maybe the first journal you're going to, they are used for publishing methods. So sometimes you're not going to win the battle because it's editorial policy. But on the other hand, there are plenty of journals that, you know, that methods are actually, methods papers are more widely read and cited. So, you know, if you look at all the most highly cited biology papers, they're all methods papers.
yeah,
Um,
but do you think it makes sense in that case to have a paper that's more, it's not a new method per se, but you could, but it's the application, right? You can still formulate that as.
If it's the application, my guess is you should formulate the paper around the result.
Right, exactly.
And then, you
I
know,
mean, I guess it's tough to distinguish sometimes, because if there's enough changes that are required to adapt it to biophysical models or something like that, where it's only been applied in very different cases before, maybe it could be a methods paper, though. It's just, yeah, interesting.
yeah, I would tend to, you don't, if it's not a method paper, I wouldn't write a conclusion like many people do, where the last sentence of the abstract or the conclusion is, this is a new method that could be useful for all kinds of other things. Like you just undermined your idea that it's, you know, the result is what a paper's about.
Right, yeah, that's a good
But
point.
people do that all the time. I see it all the time.
Yeah,
It's,
cool.
okay, well, thank you, Nate, and, Kelly for the lunch. Sorry, I was a bit late. I had a meeting over in other side of campus.
And then this
Oh,
book,
is this right here? Oh, yeah,
I
book
recommend
recommendation,
everyone read that.
both of them, right?
Yeah, so this is more mathy, but it's super helpful. The writing science and plain English, I read the first year of my PhD,
So they could read it.
and it's super helpful.
Thanks.
How long is it?
Pages, it reads